Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Don Cornegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Great to be here. Today, we have part 2 of our interview with Dr. Michael Schmidt, the founder, CEO, and chief science officer of Sovaris Aerospace, a company focused on assessments and solutions applied to humans in space and extreme environments on Earth.
So in part 1 of our interview, we talked about Michael's work in pioneering the field of precision medicine and how he was using it to improve the cognitive and physical performance of astronauts, as well as NBA and NFL players and even special operations forces. So in today's interview, we talked to Michael about NASA's plans to send humans to Mars and build permanent colonies on the Moon and Mars. We also talked to Michael about his recent book, Building a Spacefaring Civilization, which addresses the challenges of civilian spaceflight and the construction of space settlements.
Before we get to our interview with Michael, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praised field reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by a longtime listener who goes by the moniker Lifelong Learner 1. The review is titled, The Science Podcast to Rule All Others. The review reads, STEM Talk are in-depth interviews with really interesting scientists and engineers working right at the front edge. The health-related episodes are particularly interesting as the hosts and the guests go pretty far down some rabbit holes. Also, I love the episodes about space exploration. The Ask Me Anything episodes are also wonderful, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lifelong Learner 1, and thanks to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to part 2 of our interview with Dr. Michael Schmidt.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Don Cornegas, and joining us again today is Michael Schmidt. Michael, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don, and hello, Michael.
And hello, Ken. Good to talk to you again.
So, Michael, we ended part 1 of our interview with the discussion about the Human Research Program for Civilian Spaceflight. So Chris Mason at Cornell University has a biobank of 1,500 samples across 22 astronauts and 7 missions. And with today's modern technology and analytical techniques and advanced archival storage techniques for cells and tissues, we now have an infrastructure for advanced research that will tell us a lot more about the physical effects of spaceflight on humans as we move forward. So this is probably a good time to switch gears a little bit, and we get a chance to ask you to touch specifically on the cognitive and physical challenges that humans will face on long-duration missions when we're talking about places like Mars. So let's start with some of those physical challenges, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's so many physical challenges that take place, and one of the areas we like to do is kind of triage those, list them maybe from top to bottom or those of a higher priority that really stand out and that really need countermeasures today. And we usually start with muscle, bone, immune system, the cardiovascular system, but also as we think about longer missions, we think the brain and nervous system much more heavily involved. And I think one of the ways to approach that discussion is to think about them in terms of examples, so we can talk in terms of systems, or we can talk in terms of examples. And I think the examples are really illustrative. And the one I like is really telling because it's got some implications for Earth as well, but certainly space and deep space in particular, is a study that came out of the NASA Twins expedition of 340 days, intended to be a full year. And what was interesting about that, and now we're going to talk about cardiovascular implications. So there was echocardiography done to understand what was happening to changes in the heart muscle over the course of the Scott Kelly one-year mission. And over the 340 days of that mission, the left ventricle of the heart lost about 0.74 grams per week of volume. So there's an interesting corollary on Earth that gets us thinking about why that might have occurred, because Scott was undergoing roughly 2 to 2.5 hours of exercise every day. And we can talk about, how many days were missed, et cetera. But the ARAD technology was there specifically to make sure that muscle was retained and bone was retained. So this was a really interesting finding by itself. But let's take that back to an Earth analogy. So Ben Lecomte is a oceanic swimmer and a long-distance swimmer, as many of you know, and has set many, many records swimming in the Atlantic and so forth. So on one of the 159-day missions, he swam about 2,000 kilometers in the Atlantic. He lost 0.72 grams per week of left ventricular mass. So I find it really interesting that his losses, despite the fact that he was swimming, 5 to 7, 8 hours a day, he was still losing ventricular mass at that level of exertion. Now, some would say, well, the ocean is buoyant, and so it's microgravity-like. But there's another way to look at this, and that is the volume training that we're doing in these kind of conditions sufficient? Because the Ben Lecomte mission didn't involve any high-impact sprinting, right? And by and large, Scott Kelly's was a volume training paradigm. So one of the things that I take away from it, and again, we'll remove the concept of water and buoyancy for a moment, it does say something about the importance of high intensity, or let's even say sprint intensity. So you guys know about all of this work, of course, of the value of those things in a training paradigm. And what this is saying to me is that in order to maintain cardiac mass, high intensity or sprint level interval training is probably necessary to add to these programs. So I think that's one of the findings that's really interesting, is that these are modifiable risks to a degree, but we have to get better at, number one, individualizing them, but including this balance of volume versus intensity paradigm. So then another one that comes up often, and we see it changing fairly early in missions, is immune system changes. And in the recent work that we've done with some of the commercial missions, we see those immune changes in even the 3 to 5 day missions and one of the 12-day missions. There were immune changes in Scott Kelly's mission of almost 1 year, but they're showing up fairly early. The one study that's really interesting about the immune system, and we may have touched on it last time, but I'll reflect on it here, is there's a well-known phenomenon in space with a reactivation of viruses, and these would be cytomegaloviruses, Epstein-Barr virus, Visnavirus, and things like that. So the question has always been that, coupled with the reduced immune function that happens in longer duration spaceflight. How are those coupled, right? The immune deficits and the viral reactivation, they surely are. But then what can we do about that, if anything? And so Brian Crucian's group at NASA Houston, did a physical activity assessment. What they wanted to understand is, does the level of physical fitness of the astronaut going into space impact that phenomenon of viral reactivation? So they used a range of cardiorespiratory fitness measures. The ones that really stood out were the number of push-ups in 2 minutes that one could do and the number of total pull-ups. What really stood out is that if you compared the highest quartile of the most fit to the lowest quartile of the least fit with those two measures, there was about a 29 to 39% reduced viral reactivation in those most fit individuals, meaning that the level of fitness going into space seemed to be protective against viral reactivation. Well, that's a really landmark study, I think, that continues to give us more and more information and insight about, the criticality of physical fitness. I want to draw one corollary to that, because we've followed this problem of brain-derived neurotrophic factor changes in remote settings and in space, etc. If you look at the animal literature on this, when exposed to radiation, BDNF levels, and another one called TRK-B and Krebs, they declined pretty significantly, whether you go to 10 gray or 30 gray, and those are very high doses, and I'll talk a little bit later about lower doses. But those neuroplasticity-focused proteins drop considerably in the radiation environment. But in the animals who exercise, and so it's treadmill running, they're actually protected quite significantly against those negative effects of radiation on the central nervous system, neuroplastic proteins. So that's a very strong statement, I think, that continues to grow in terms of just the importance of physical activity. Probably things like muscle mass, muscle strength, muscle fitness, even going into space. So it's partly a question of reserves. And we can talk about reserves later, but I think overall, going into space with the greatest level of reserves, whether it's brain, cardiovascular, muscle, bone, are really critical elements of preparation for space travel. So then another one that comes up that has risen high on the list is something called SANS, which is space-associated neuroocular syndrome. And this really is a phenomenon that has been studied in the last 10 years. And this is where there's various changes in visual acuity and various circulatory changes in the retina, cotton wool spots and things like that. It happens in about 40% of astronauts that go into space for longer than 4 months. And so this has become a real focus of trying to address and solve this problem. And there are some genetic relationships to this. It turns out that those who have variations in the genes for 1-carbon metabolism do have a particular increased risk. That's not the only risk, but it looks to be part of the individual, one of the components of the individual risk between astronauts. Another one that showed up in about 2019 was something called jugular vein stasis. And so, as we know in space, there's a fluid shift that goes cephalic or headward, and the brain really doesn't have a pumping mechanism to move its cerebral spinal fluid out. It's reliant upon gravity. So, of course, when you end up in a microgravity situation, fluid tends to accumulate in the cranium that affects the eyeballs as well. It's part of the SANS problem, but not all. But draining that out can become challenging. And so in looking at venous flow in the 2019 studies, about 55% of the astronauts had jugular vein stasis. And 1 and perhaps 2 had evidence of clotting. So that really rose that phenomenon to a higher level and is something now that's being taken very seriously. In other words, so what part of this is mechanical, anatomical, what part of it is genetic? And so these are the things where these concepts that we're talking about here, systems medicine, multi-omics, complex physiologic measures, precision medicine really start to come into play, because we really need to understand when an astronaut goes into space, do they have a particular individual risk that's knowable and actionable? And then, of course, there's the usual issue of bone that is still trying to be solved. And I would say in general, there's a high variability between individual astronauts in terms of how their bone will respond in space, how their nervous system and cognition will respond in space, how the muscular system will respond, etc. So again, that just points us towards individualization and getting better at that. And I'll just end with, this is going to become an increasing problem as we fly civilians in space who may have comorbidities. And then the whole landscape changes of the kinds of concomitant conditions they have or concomitant medications that they're on. That's going to complicate this significantly. And that's the domain where we don't have very much data. And that's why there's important for human research for civilians in space.
In terms of cognitive challenges, and you touched on this very briefly a moment ago, the hippocampus, which is the key memory center of the nervous system, has a relatively low radiation threshold before there are issues. So what do we know about the vulnerability of these brain tissues once we place humans in a high radiation environment of GCR on the way to a place like Mars?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to look at that. And some of it is going to be some of the human data we have, but of course the human data is going to lack certain anatomical findings. And then the animal data is really informative. And I think where I'd like to sort of start that discussion is in some of Charlie Lamoli's work, which I just briefly mentioned in our previous conversation. But what I like about Charlie's work, he's at UC Irvine. He's been on NASA grants for many, many years, and he's been using what we refer to as space fluent levels of radiation. So in the past, a lot of the radiation studies were looking at things like 10 gray, 20 gray, 30 gray. And while there is a lot of information to be gleaned from that, those were not really relatable to the typical space radiation exposures, which are down in the milligray and the centigray range. And so what Charlie was doing is using mice and rats and using 50 to 30 centigray, let's say, as a common radiation dose, and then doing it for weeks to months. So sometimes the studies would include 8 weeks of exposure and then up to 6 months of exposure. And then what they would do is they would put the animals through a wide range of cognitive tests and then cellular analysis to try and understand what the effects of those kinds of radiations are instituting. And I think the way to start talking about Charlie's studies rather than going into each of the individual studies is to look first at, well, what are the cognitive measures that changed or that deteriorated in those? And so one of them that typically tends to change is novel object recognition. And so that's really indicating deficits in recognition memory. So these are the kinds of studies where, you have a novel object in the environment for the mice, and you might do radiation for 6 weeks or 6 months, and then test them 4 months after the radiation exposure had occurred, and those deficits still persist. There were spatial memory deficits that are very common in those studies. And I mentioned a little bit last time the contextual fear conditioning tasks, and I just want to speak about that again because I think it really relates to the human clinical paradigm. So remember, these fear extinction studies, there's an electrified grid that the mouse has to pass over, go in one end and come out the other. Usually they move in without incident. They would pair a tone with an electrification of the floor, and then the natural response is for the mice or the rats to freeze in place. So that's an indication of simply learning, right? There's a threat, they freeze, and eventually they take the electrified grid out of the equation, and the mice just walk in and they hear the tone and they freeze. So now it's called fear conditioning. And that's taking place in the limbic system with the hippocampus and the amygdala. But if you continue to remove the electrification, eventually the mice realize after about 25 to 30 times, there's no more threat and they'll just pass through. So that's an unlearning of the fear response. When they expose these animals to radiation at these relatively low doses, but over time, they were not able to unlearn that fear response. So that persisted, and that was suggesting that something hardwired was taking place in the brain. Charlie likens that to a PTS syndrome in a combat soldier, where they just seem to be unable to unlearn the fear response. And so that was a fairly significant finding at the cognitive behavior level. There were executive function impairments, so a whole range of attention shifting tasks and conditioning paradigms they were failing at. A very strong increase in anxiety-like behavior increased in some of the studies, and they used various things like elevated mazes and open field tests to understand that. The reason these studies are done this way is they have human corollaries, and so if we look at this, what it's really saying is aspects of the cortex, the limbic system, the amygdala, and the hippocampus are changing in adverse ways in the course of these relatively small radiation exposures in mice. And that's got those of us on the human side fairly concerned because I asked Charlie in one of our roundtables, I said, so you've done a lot of studies in human or in animal exposures to low levels of radiation. And I said, it's been the prevailing paradigm in spaceflight radiation research that we are most concerned about radiogenic cancers. And he said, yep. He said, I'm totally with you there. And I said, so how much radiogenic cancer have you seen in these animals? He said, we just don't see it. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't occur, and I'm not trying to diminish it. What I'm really trying to say is we may need to be more concerned about the functional deficits coming from radiation exposure than perhaps we have been. And I want to take this to sort of mission level, maybe a little bit later in our conversation, but let's just step then from the cognitive measures in these animal tests and to the cellular changes. Now, this is where it gets really strong to look at the correlations between what was observed in a behavioral sense and what's happening at the molecular and cell level. So one of the critical things, if you think about how a neuron connects itself, you have a single axon and then a neuron body and then 20,000, 10,000 to 20,000, depending upon the cell type, dendritic branches. So this is the part that branches all over the rest of the brain and nervous system so that, one neuron can make many, many connections and be engaged in many, many functions. So the dendritic spine density was reduced in hippocampal neurons pretty dramatically, depending upon exposures, something like 30%. Let's just use that as a frame of reference for this discussion. That's really significant. What that means is it's actually retracting. So it's one thing to inhibit the growth of these dendrites. It's another thing to actually have retracting dendrites. This is going to suggest that there are implications for, both the prefrontal cortex, like I say, the limbic system, probably sensory motor areas, but he didn't look at that. It was mainly on the behavioral side that he's been looking so far. So that's a critical finding. Second critical finding is neuroinflammation. Well, it was observed with increased microglial activation. Essentially, the central nervous system was becoming more inflamed. And if we'll jump later to our ApoE discussions and things like that. But inflammation is really one of the critical and most costly changes at the molecular level in the nervous system. And once the microglia are being activated, you get a kind of a persistent inflammation that's a little harder to knock down unless you have a deliberate method to do that, or that's part of your countermeasure package. And then another one, finally, and I'll kind of leave it at this, is the neurogenesis was suppressed in the hippocampus. And so if we recall, the CA1, or the dentate gyrus, the CA1 region of the hippocampus is really one of the major centers for stem cells in the brain. In fact, it is the one region that consistently produces stem cells in the brain into adulthood. And some of the work shows that each hippocampus produces about maybe 700 per day on each side, so 1,400. So that was impaired as well. So the ability for neurogenesis is being impaired with these radiation exposures. So just to jump very quickly then, one of our concerns, and many in the field who've followed this and work with this, is we need to become very deliberate of trying to address the functional changes that could be happen in the radiation and microgravity environment with relation to the CNS. And that involves, a whole other discussion about addressing the various cascades and molecular networks in the brain that are taking place, and that, we found some of them are changing in that space environment. So I'll pause there and see if you have any further thoughts on that. But I think that's some of what's very instructive to us is some of the animal literature. And I'll just add one last thing. If we couple it with the rat experiment data, so we now really have quantitative data coming from the rat experiment to Mars, now we have a little better ability to put quantitative numbers to the kinds of radiation exposure on the way to Mars and on the surface of Mars, and now some of this kind of exposure data.
That's interesting, and it's not always easy to extrapolate, of course, from animal models to humans, particularly thinking of cognitive issues, but it's certainly a reason for concern, I would say. As we've previously discussed on STEM Talk, the ApoE4 variant of the apolipoprotein E gene is associated with impaired cognitive performance under some circumstances and increased risk of developing dementia. As we don't know how the ApoE4 genotype in astronauts correlates with their cognitive outcomes, this would seem fairly concerning when we think about going to space on long-duration missions without some correlation there, or at least some appreciation of whether that's really an issue.
Yeah, I think this is always a challenging study, Ken, to do in humans, right? Because we can't expose them to radiation. There are a couple of studies that we talked about last time on ApoE in relation to chemotherapy, and a smaller number of studies related to ApoE outcomes and radiation, cranial radiation, and there's one in particular. And these are fairly high levels, right? So it was the radiation therapy oncology group that was using 37.5 gray of whole brain radiation, and they did see very significant differences between the ApoE4 and the 2 carriers. Learning and memory changes, delayed recognition, executive function, and various other challenges to cognition. What they didn't find is that the ApoE4 accelerated the rate of cognitive decline, but over time they did show that there was a distinct difference. And so I would say the lesson there is that we now have some data that's showing in humans that the radiation exposures with ApoE4 does produce a different trajectory. The level of radiation was much higher than space, so we still don't know that space fluent number. And we really do have to study this carefully in that space environment. And one of the key challenges, and it's easier with, I think, the commercial astronauts because they're allowing us to use their SNP data, is we will better understand there who is an ApoE4 carrier. In the astronaut corps, that's still private medical information, and so we really don't know yet how to correlate the ApoE4 genotypes in professional human spaceflight with their cognitive outcomes. But I would say at this point, we probably should be erring on the side of, let's say, caution and trying to understand that much, much better than we do. I think the question always comes up is, are we going to use that then to determine whether or not someone should fly, or simply whether or not someone should be given a different set of countermeasures as they go forward into space? And that's probably going to be debated for some time. I will say this, one of the areas we look at carefully in this kind of a genotype, and also this happens in the concussion world where we work, with military and blast injuries and Navy SEALs with exposures to blasts, but also the fast boat groups and athletes and so forth. Does the ApoE4 convey any additional risks, and what are the countermeasures? So we're always looking at that area of countermeasures. And I want to share one countermeasure just quickly, because it'll bridge us later into another discussion of, why genotype is important for, let's say, differences in men and women in space. There was a study done with looking at the impact of different dietary intakes on the progression to dementia. And one of the findings that occurred was the discovery that the key element in the diet that was responsible for the most protection of cognition over time was phosphatidylcholine. Most people know it as lecithin. It's found predominantly in things like eggs and muscle meats and things like that. It's got a choline group and usually long-chain fatty acids on the tail of it. And it's used to make all of the cell membranes, whether that's brain or retina, the synapses, muscle tissue, liver tissue. It's just the part of the architecture of human cell membranes. And it accounts for about 50% of all the phospholipids in the cell membrane. Well, they found that those in the highest quartile of intake had about a 28% lower risk of dementia. And this even occurred in the ApoE carriers. And so that was a really pleasing response. And mechanistically, I'll say phosphatidylcholine is one of the critical things in reverse cholesterol transport. And of course, ApoE4 is involved in transporting lipids out of the cell and out of the neuron. Phosphatidylcholine donates one of its fatty acid tails to cholesterol, makes it a cholesterol ester, and then it can be transported out. So having phosphatidylcholine mechanistically makes an awful lot of sense why it would impact the brain in this way. But we also make a lot of phosphatidylcholine, and we have a gene called PEMP, phosphatidylethanolamin methyltransferase. I want to talk about that later, but I just wanted to raise it here because this balance then of our phosphatidylcholine intake and the genes that regulate our phosphatidylcholine synthesis converge in very, very critical ways. And this becomes part of the precision medicine thinking as we're trying to optimize for somebody going into space. So imagine if you had the PEMP gene variant and poor phosphatidylcholine intake. Okay, you would have a different level of risk. But imagine if you had the optimal gene and heavy phosphatidylcholine intake. Now you're improving your risk profile. So these are these converging elements that we'll continue to talk about here. But I'll kind of leave it there and see if you have any further thoughts or ideas to add.
Well, it's very analogous in many ways to conversations with professional sports, particularly football or boxing, where the ApoE4 status of the player is an interesting issue. And who's got the ball? In other words, is that an issue for the league? Is it an issue for the club? Is it a privacy issue for the player? But it's kind of a similar situation. And I would think clearly people going into space, particularly on a long-duration mission, they should be aware of their ApoE4 status and give this some thought.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. And I would say, if I were going into space, I'd want to know, because then I'd want to start to address all of the particular countermeasures that would modify that risk. And there's a wide range of it, right? Lean body mass, muscle composition, mitochondrial function, ingestion of things like high fructose corn syrup, body mass index, glucose levels, hemoglobin A1C levels, insulin levels. Like there's a range of things that are really so within our control, alcohol consumption and things like that. Just everything we do from a lifestyle standpoint has a higher risk in an ApoE44 genotype, and those cognitive impairments set in much earlier in life than they would with someone else. So yeah, I would want to know that. And I'd want to know my baseline cognitive measures going into space so that if, when I come back, I have some frame of reference for, let's look at EEG, for example, N100, P300, N400 brainwaves, things like that. If I knew that going into space, I'd have a frame of reference to come back to. So now I know what kind of recovery I have to engage in to try and reach my baseline.
Mm-hmm. Here on Earth, as we've discussed earlier today, we do see an increased risk of cognitive impacts from medical radiation. And as we all know, medical radiation is not at all the same as galactic cosmic radiation or, in particular, solar particle events. But still, it seems like it sort of gives us a clue. You mentioned this earlier. And it's hard on Earth to have a ethical radiation experience that with humans that in any way is a strong analogy to radiation in space. And this then drives us back to the animal model. It's sort of an interesting dilemma.
Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely is, the ethics around it, and it's going to create a kind of a continual gap for us. And really the best way we're going to be able to garner that kind of data is with a really strong human research program that's consistently looking at and asking these questions and getting some perspective on those risk levels and on those outcome levels and how do they persist. A lot of things that happen in space, there is a recovery of them, as you know, once you get back to Earth. But there are some that don't recover in the same way. And so what can we do about those things that aren't as prone to recovery? How are they individualized? And what can we do more before the mission or in mission or post mission when those things are recovering slowly or not recovering? You mentioned something that I maybe is a good time to jump into just for a brief moment. And that is, we talk a lot about radiation exposure as part of the paradigm of, let's say, any of the biomedical changes, but right now we're talking about cognition. But I wanted to just jump back to one study that, Stan and Din just did this, I think back in about 2014. I mentioned it briefly before, but this was the BDNF study in Antarctica for 14 months. I think they finally published it in about 2021. It was initially out as an abstract. It's an area we've been interested in a long time, asking the question, if you're down in Antarctica for that length of time, is there anything happening to these neuroplastic proteins, neuroplastic networks, that's just due to that environment, right? Because that's not a radiation environment like space. That's a high stress environment. But that's an isolation environment, one of the most unique isolation environments we have. And to see that significant decline in hippocampal volume and some of the cognitive measures, and the hippocampal volume decline was measured with MRI, voxel-based imaging, and then so the BDNF levels went down, cognitive changes were noticed, and hippocampal volume went down. That says a lot about the isolation component of space flight. And so if I were looking at a mission to Mars, for example, that's going to be certainly a long duration radiation exposure that we've never had before with astronauts. But it's also going to be isolation at a level we've never remotely encountered. I mean, I try to imagine sometimes what it's going to be like to see the Earth disappearing.
Yeah. Look out the window and it's nothing but black.
Yeah. And to watch it getting further and further away and knowing you're so alone, like no analog on Earth has ever been able to recreate that, and I don't believe will be able to, even if you put them in a mine shaft or what have you. Everyone knows they're still here. But that isolation, we don't know what that's going to impart. So I think it's important for us at the cognitive level as well to really understand the isolation components and try to prepare for countermeasures for that in the best way possible. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I wanted to add that into the formula here because isolation is certainly talked about, but it's not always talked about in the sort of the converging point with radiation and their collective influence on the brain.
So, Michael, we recently interviewed Pascal Lee, who's a planetary scientist who leads the Mars Institute, and he's also the director of the NASA Hot and Mars project at NASA Ames Research Center. So because there's so many biological and engineering challenges regarding a 300 million mile journey to Mars, he actually argues that we should take a measured approach in terms of putting humans on Mars. And it's even his view that we should consider making a round trip to Mars and not even worry about landing on the planet just yet. So what are your thoughts on this approach?
Yeah, I like what he's saying, and I'm going to add one other kind of converging point because it comes kind of inherent in your question when we're talking about how to plan these things, and that goes to the merging of the engineering and the biomedical people. And I wanted to note something that I was pretty pleased about because it ties into the answer to this question. So the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics has a space architecture committee, and they commissioned a decadal survey on space architecture, which is going to be completed this year. So they had approached me and my team about leading a chapter on the biological drivers of space architecture. And we have a human exploration committee in AIAA. So it's a good fit and a natural fit. But I was pleased to see that the people at the design level are thinking about, we need to get the biomedical people involved in this discussion right up front, so that when we engineer, design anything, that the biomedical people saying, what's the impact on the human going to be, or what are the tools, instruments, and capabilities that the humans need in order to execute a mission, so that those are built in as well. And so I liked what the way you kind of structured this with this question about, all of the biomedical needs and the considerations in going to a place like Mars. And obviously we're all very excited about the Mars concept and going to Mars. I think the free return, as it's often called, is one of the ideal, and there's lots of reasons for it, but one of the ideal approaches to use in going to Mars, either to orbit the planet for a specified number of orbits and then return. There's a discussion I know that we'll probably get to here with Deimos and Phobos. There's some arguments that we should stage there. And, there's some strong cases for that. But I would say personally, and a lot of my colleagues would agree with this on the medical side, that trying to land and trying to take off of Mars adds such a level of complexity that we are probably not ready for yet. And maybe, the risk of mission failure goes up when we add those two layers of complexity to it. So I would fall into that camp of, as much as I would love to put someone on the surface of Mars, I think a free return, like we did originally with the moon, of course, is probably going to be the safest way to do it. Obviously, you could say, well, that's a lot of expense and a lot of complexity and a lot of risk to go all the way there and just come back. That's not untrue. But it is a question of, what is our readiness level? And, and I think that's a discussion that has to be had between the engineers, architects, and biomedical people who are planning these things. And a lot are saying that, we're not ready for the land and takeoff.
No, not even close with respect to entry, descent, and landing.
Yep.
Something as large as a lander for a human mission, don't really know how to do that. I mean, there's not an agreed upon or even a method that would provide high confidence. If you look how the rovers, which are much, much, much smaller, have landed on Mars, the one I was involved with used airbags, and it was a tiny little rover. And now they're, a little smaller than a Mini Cooper maybe, but a really complex sort of Rube Goldberg entry, descent, and landing system that you would never use with humans. So I think there's a real challenge there. And that leads us to a potential alternative. Mars has these two potato-shaped moons, Phobos and Deimos. And we mentioned Pascal Lee earlier, and Pascal and I are both fans and have some degree of fascination with Phobos. And this is another topic we've studied in these meetings I mentioned for NASA. And I understand you're also really interested in Phobos. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's different reasons for it that are mission focused. I know Buzz Aldrin became really one of those animated proponents of Phobos in particular. But there's a lot of reasons that are mission focused, that if we were going to land on something, something like Deimos or Phobos would be ideal for that.
Sure.
All kinds of staging reasons, easier to get on and off, and wouldn't have to go through the complexities as you clearly described we're unready for to get onto the surface. And maybe won't be for, in your kind of evaluation of it, Ken, how many years, decades are we away from that capability of getting on and off the planet?
I'm not sure, but it's a big issue. As you know, the Martian gravity well is significant, and the atmosphere is much less than Earth, but still significant. And so we really haven't worked out a good EDL system, entry, descent, and landing system for something like a human lander on Mars. The other thing about Phobos that's so attractive is one can think of it as a sort of collection plate. So the surface of Phobos is almost certainly covered with lots of ejecta from Mars. And that would be very interesting because it doesn't have the corrosive sort of atmosphere of Mars. You don't have to land on Mars to have a Mars sample return with a human. And of course, you'd be landing ever so gently on Phobos, almost docking with it. And I think Mars in the background also, if a human was on Phobos, Mars would fill much of the sky behind the human, and it would be an incredibly motivating image, I believe.
Yeah. Well, and just because of their rotational cycles, right? They would
Right.
be the view you'd get of the Mars surface going around repeatedly would be extraordinary.
Really incredible.
Yeah, it would be life changing, right? I mean, it would be civilization altering, probably. And as I know we've talked before, having a robot do that is useful and interesting. But there's something about having humans there doing that garners a different kind of attention from Earth dwellers, if you will. It would be fascinating to have a crew on Phobos conducting these missions, and as you say, bringing back some of those samples.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, on that note, this is probably a really good time to talk about your book, Michael. The book title is Building a Spacefaring Civilization. The subtitle of the book, which you co-authored with Dr. Marianne Legato, is Advancing the Renaissance of Science, Medicine, and Human Performance in Civilian Spaceflight. So in the book, you describe a future where humans will develop space settlements on the moon and Mars. So it'd be great if you could talk about the chapter in the book where you tackle the question of space radiation from the standpoint of precision medicine, kind of building on what we've already talked about a little bit already in this interview.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think that's really an interesting focus for just about everything we do, because we're trying to extract these signals of what is actionable, what is its biological meaning, and then what are the countermeasures for those. And the way we have looked at the radiation question, it really derives from a central premise, and that is, we recognize there's individual variability in radiation susceptibility and repair and so forth. Some of those are genetic, and some of those are functional. So some are related to things like the PARP gene, and I won't go into all of those, but some are related to, functional metabolic changes that are actionable in and of themselves. Sometimes the genetics drives a functional change, so then we have to interact downstream with that. And then we always look at it from the standpoint of converging variables. So let's say you have one variant. Okay, that has an implication for your radiation protection and repair. But what if you have 2 and then 3 and then 4? And, we look at this from the standpoint of something called participation numbers. So let's imagine that you have something like NAD, and it's one of the critical elements as a coenzyme in energy metabolism, but it's also critical in, 400 distinct metabolic reactions across the human body. So some of these things account for 6, 7, or even up to 15% of all metabolic reactions. So we get into then a question of scaling. So if you have a deficit that hits 400 different pathways, and then you have another deficit that hits another 500 pathways, and another that's even larger or approximating that, now we're starting to impact hundreds and hundreds of metabolic networks simultaneously. And so the way we describe that is a scaling effect. And so I want to talk about just a few of these in principle, because they really play to this concept of individual impact and scaling impact. So let's take 1-carbon metabolism as a first one. So that's methyl groups and methyl transfer and things like that. People have heard a lot about the MTHFR gene and some of those related genes that are very common gene variants in people on Earth. 30% of some populations have the MTHFR gene variant. There's a big European study of 10,000 people where 85% had one variant, and at least one variant in each of the 3 main genes in this pathway. So it's really quite common. But what happens in 1-carbon metabolism, when we take the base uracil, we have to make it into something called thymine. And that's the T in AGTC, right, in the base pairing in a gene. So we have to convert uracil to thymine. That conversion takes 1 methyl group, and it's a simple methyl transfer, and now you make thymine. So what happens when you have decreased B12 and folate, or you have one of the variants in the 1-carbon genes? Well, you don't have enough methyl groups to methylate the uracil. So the uracil gets inserted into the gene, and the repair enzymes read that as a mutational event. It tries to fix it. It's called the uracil glycosylase, but it tries to go in and pull that uracil and find a thymine to put in there. So it's fixing a single strand break. So you can imagine in studies where they've loaded individuals or they've done cell culture, what happens when you deplete them of B12 and folic acid is their uracil numbers in the nucleus climb dramatically. And so you can imagine now if you're trying to assemble a genome that requires thymine, but the cell has mostly access to uracil, it's going to put uracil in those genes, in the DNA strands, and that's going to be viewed as a mutational event, right? The body's going to be constantly trying to repair that and finding more thymine. Well, the way to fix that is to load the body with B12 and folate. And in these studies, it shows clearly that it does create more thymine. Those DNA strand breaks disappear, and all is well. So let's look at that from then the standpoint of a single mutational event. So if we go into the space radiation environment, we know that radiation can create single and double strand breaks in and of itself. So the way we look at this aspect of one carbon metabolism and gene vulnerability, the radiation is like a second step of a mutational event. So you've got one carbon gene deficits or one carbon metabolite deficits. We say that's a mutational event one. Let's say you now carry that status into space where you've already got strand breaks happening that require the DNA repair system, and that needs to be accounted for. Otherwise, it creates a new vulnerability in space. So let's go back to our SANS question for just a moment. One of the critical features has been finding in SANS, the space-associated neuroocular syndrome, is variations in the one carbon genetic network. What wasn't looked at in that study, and I'm not doing that in a critical way at all, I'm just saying here's another aspect of that, whereby if you have those genotypes and those deficits, you are actually more sensitive to radiation exposures because you already have mutational events going on just due to the one carbon metabolism genes or nutrients or metabolite variants. So we can think of this then as one knowable, actionable metabolic deficit that will impact our susceptibility to radiation in space. So let's pick another one, which is iron. So there are iron genotypes. It's called HFE or hemochromatosis genotypes. And there's 3 primary genes, and they're fairly common in the population. Again, some of the main genes, 25 to 30% of the population, they cause you to accumulate excess iron. And as you accumulate excess iron, you become more susceptible to radiation because iron is a oxidative catalyst. So when iron concentrations are high, loading with doses of radiation trigger more mutational events because of that oxidative catalyst of irons, just like iron rusting your car, which those of us who are old enough saw a lot of rusted cars, but not so much these days. But that's the process of oxidation that happens in the cells. So radiation, we would argue, you wouldn't want to go into a radiation environment if you had the hemochromatosis genotype. If you did go in with that genotype, you would want to take some preemptive actions, right, to keep your transferrin saturations below 50% before you go into space. And then you would modify the iron intake in your diet in space so that you're not increasing the ingestion of iron while you're in the high radiation environment. And I'll say one other thing that some people sometimes ask you, you work with astronauts, strike fighter pilots, special forces and athletes, etc. But what do those have to do with space? We learn a lot from these elite performers in extreme environments. And one example is this. So in one of our, we've seen a pattern, so I'll just say it as a pattern. In many of our elite performer teams, we started seeing evidence of hemochromatosis in, young athletes in their 20s. Well, that shouldn't really manifest until you're in your 50s or 60s, but now we're seeing it in the 20s. But these are some of the highest paid, most exceptional athletes in the world. And they have these hemochromatosis signatures of transferrin saturation of 75, 85%. So we started asking, well, is this protective in some way that, while they're young, prefer performance, but it's problematic as they get older? And so we hadn't seen much in the literature, so we started talking about it, but we did run into then eventually a paper in the French literature where they took their ultramarathoners and endurance athletes and ran these genotypes, and they found the penetrance was close to 80%, and they found that those who made the podium, basically winners, were even higher. So imagine we have a genotype that'll kill you faster when you're older, but somehow when you're younger, it makes you a superb athlete. That's the paradigm that's emerging out of this. So our question is then, Well, okay, we've got a lot of high performers going into the space environment. And do these qualify as some of those with this hemochromatosis genotype, which concentrates a lot of iron? So do they benefit from it on the one hand? But if you go into space with that genotype, it's going to affect your DNA. And so I'll leave that subject there. It's a long and interesting one, but let's move on to another one. So magnesium would be a further example of that. So magnesium is involved in all ATP reactions, and it's involved in, so the entirety of the energy metabolism infrastructure of the human body is dependent on magnesium. It binds directly to ATP to stabilize these three phosphate groups on the molecule. So, I mean, it is structurally integral to ATP, but also structurally integral to many of the DNA repair enzymes. So when you deplete in, let's say, cell culture animals, magnesium, and then you look at DNA repair capability, it just falls. And what we know from space in the early studies is that magnesium is being lost through loss of bone and loss of muscle. And so the reservoirs, those are the main reservoirs of magnesium in the body. So if a cell needs it, it can always go to the reservoir and draw that out. So we know magnesium's an issue in space, and I won't go into some of the recent studies that might contradict that, but those were being magnesium supplemented, so you'd expect there to be an improvement. What we don't know is, does the level of magnesium that protects energy metabolism and bone and muscle and other functions, is that enough to also maintain protection of DNA? Because again, magnesium is this imperative for DNA repair. So that's a critical feature, and you can kind of see as we get to this converging variable concept. Now we've got one, carbon metabolism, we've got iron excess, magnesium deficits. They're all cascading together to affect different aspects of DNA maintenance and repair. And then I'll just add one last one, and that's NAD. So we know NAD is, that critical energy cofactor. NAD is also involved in PARP. And in our textbook chapter, we lay all of these out with images and pathway maps and things like that. But I'll just say quickly, so when there's an injury to DNA, let's say a single strand point break on a DNA molecule, it recruits something called PARP, poly-ADP ribose polymerase. And what that means is the body sticks a PARP molecule on there, and then from there it recruits the DNA repair enzymes like endonucleases. Well, how does PARP get assembled? It gets built from NAD molecules. So imagine you've got something in your gas tank that's the fuel for your car. But you've got another process in the car that requires that gasoline. Now, obviously, car doesn't do this, but for the analogy purposes. So now you've got something siphoning gas out of the car to repair something else over here. And so what's happening is the body's recruiting that NAD pool that it needs for these 400 different enzymatic reactions in the body, including energy. And it's one by one assembling a PARP molecule for the DNA repair. And it takes 200 of those NAD molecules to make one PARP molecule. So now imagine to fix a single strand break, you're taking 200 molecules that would be used for burning glucose, burning fat, et cetera, and you're just removing those, right? They're not converted to anything. They're just removed from the pool. And now imagine you've got dozens, hundreds, thousands of DNA breaks, and now you're just starving out the NAD pool that's needed for all these other things. So we're saying that is those things are knowable. We want to prepare for them. We want to make sure in our countermeasure packages that we have either NAD itself or NAD precursors, because we want to be able to account for these kinds of losses. So I'll just quickly say then, so if we even take just these 4 items, we have measurements for those to determine status. We have countermeasures for those to have a solution in hand. We would want to know those before going into space. We would want to correct those before going into space. And depending upon what their individual signatures are, want to account for those while in space, and then certainly after returning from space, address how those have been altered or how they've properly recovered, etc. So that's the essence of that chapter, and it goes into a lot of the research, a lot of the literature for why this case is very strong. But it also gives us an additional way of looking at radiation susceptibility from the metabolic network vantage point that includes genes, epigenomics, transcriptomics, proteome metabolome, and all of these critical molecular features that we capture in the omics assessments.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
Okay, so Michael, that's a fantastic summary. So after we had wrapped up part one of your interview, you mentioned how you had worked with John Clark on a few NASA projects. John is a former NASA flight surgeon. He used to work here at IHMC. He's also a very good friend, mentor to many of us and many of the people who have been on STEM Talk. He was also our guest on episodes 55 and 56 of STEM Talk. And you brought up how John told you, in rather explicit language, I might add, that a human mission to Mars would be the most dangerous thing we've ever done. That's something that people don't appreciate, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're actually right there, Dawn. And I'll first say, I consider John a friend and one of the true legends and pioneers in human spaceflight. And, he is, as you know, so execution minded, right? Theories are great, but let's go test it. Let's figure it out. And, that's what I love about John. And truly, one of the most, I think, significant people in the human spaceflight field over the last several decades. And so I have great respect for him and a great friendship with him. But yeah, we had that conversation and he used a little bit of expletive and it was basically saying, people don't get how, and of course death is, the ultimate danger, and we face that in a lot of things. And so, but in terms of the mission risk and how to keep people alive, John was really asserting this thing is going to be darn dangerous, and just some of the most basic things, right? Everything outside of a spacesuit or a space capsule is lethal. And this is one of the premises that the space designers and architects and engineers look at it from, and obviously the biomedical side as well. Everything outside a suit or a habitat or spacecraft is immediately lethal. And so those systems that protect and contain that, and they just have to be infallible, right? And then once you've solved that problem, then you have all the other dangers of the kinds of things that we've been talking about and others have talked about how do we get there and how do we manage the disease and the illness or accidents and injuries and degradation of, we talked about cognition. What if that's affecting things like team cohesion and decision making and morale and the ability to interpret complex data as cognitive deterioration might set in on one or more astronauts. And, that's not even the kinds of biomedical things like, an appendix rupturing in space or appendicitis or something that would require surgery. There's a whole nother subject that we're pretty actively involved in is the Space Surgery Association. Are we going to do surgery in space? Do we have to have the capability on what kinds of missions? And so we just won't have anything we're used to, and we won't even have, we've had a luxury of the space station of having a pretty robust exercise platform as a countermeasure. Well, there really isn't going to be a footprint for most of that stuff in some of these, Artemis, for example. Some of these spacecraft won't have the footprint for some of those things. So we won't have some of the really effective countermeasures. People think about countermeasures like exercise in terms of muscle, bone, and maybe cardiac. The effect on immunity we talked about, the effect on cognition, we've talked about, the protection from radiation, talked about. And I would put in muscle strength, muscle mass, muscle conditioning high on the list of a countermeasure for a vast number of systems, not just kind of the narrow ones that often get thought of, let's say, by the public or certain people who are narrowed in on bone and muscle, for example. So yeah, it's that sort of collective awareness that John and I were speaking about is this is going to be the darndest, most complicated thing maybe humans have ever done. And we've got to be ready for it.
Yes, I agree. And we've been discussing now on and off for a while the difficulty of a Mars mission. And you've worked with a lot of organizations, including SpaceX, which was founded by Elon Musk. And in addition to sending civilians into space, he has a program he calls SpaceX Mars Colonization Program. And the goal is to establish a self-sustained settlement colony on Mars. As a member of the Explore Mars program, what are your thoughts on the additional challenges? So we've already discussed the challenges of a sortie-type mission. You go to Mars, tough, land, really tough, and depart, pretty hard too. But when you talk about a self-sustained colony, he recently, with employees, mentioned in 20 years having 1 million people on Mars. I personally find this beyond ridiculous, but I wondered if you had thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the numbers question is always an interesting one. I always view these as aspirational, and then when we get to the ground level, how could we actually accomplish it? And I think that is going to be even more difficult, as we've talked, than getting to Mars. And one of the areas we work in is remote medicine training, wilderness medicine certification, etc. And as we've talked, work with a lot of former, spec ops guys on our teams here at Sovaris Aerospace. And I say that because they're used to forward operations where they don't have any resupply. They somehow have to get out on their own in many cases, and they have become experts at operating in low resource environments. And, in the wilderness medicine community, you have a lot of search and rescue that gets called in, or you have evacuations you get to call in. We've been in deep jungle with expeditions with groups like National Geographic. In those kind of expeditions on Earth, you still have the chance for rescue. But on these missions, we won't. So the ability to self-contain just about everything we need, I think, is a monumental task in and of itself. Even like in the jungle of Costa Rica, if you get bit by a fer-de-lance, you might not have enough time to even get airlifted out of there to get to a place with antivenom, and that'll be our life on Mars, right? We just won't be able to prepare for everything, and we'll be taking risks, like the settlers took, but even worse. I mean, that's why we really started that task of building a spacefaring civilization. And of course, we didn't cover all the subjects, but we wanted to bring some of the experts together and really discuss, what are some of the key things that we're going to have to do? Not really the impossibility of doing it, but what are all the dangers, the risks, the needs, and things like that. And I think that building the colony will be, that'll rise to another level of difficulty.
Yep.
Of anything the human race has ever done. Everything from food to medical care.
Food alone will be a massive problem. With the Martian atmosphere and soil, the regolith on Mars, it's going to be a big problem. I think it's more of a wishful or a marketing thing, but I will bet not only will there not be 1 million humans on Mars in 20 years, there won't be one.
Yeah, we have to figure out how to probably get 10 people to somehow thrive on Mars without dying, without constant resupply, figuring out the food program. The other things, and you've probably thought a lot about this, one of the key things for morale in any kind of a remote setting is the food. And the more limited and the more monotonous the food gets, the more that becomes a social issue, a personal issue, and a team cohesion issue. And so the lack of diversity of the food supply in a settlement like that, that'll become an inherent problem. Just, eating protein from algae every day, no matter how you flavor it, will eventually become monotonous, and it'll become an issue. And so how do we even get to, there's the sustaining level of food that you'd need, but there's also the kinds that you'd need for an actual culture or a thriving program. Mm-hmm. And we haven't really come close, I would say, to solving those.
Right. I always, it slightly bugs me when people talk about things that are fanciful, and then if you ask them about it, they'll say, well, it's motivational. It's actually demotivational. So when we don't appreciate how hard even a lunar program is, or tremendously more difficult, a land and return from Mars program, and when we've put in people's heads that in the very near future, there'll be cities on Mars, it makes the real accomplishment seem inadequate. And I have had people ask me, why have we not sent humans back to Mars? In other words, the appreciation of how hard that is sort of diminished by talking about essentially a city on Mars that doesn't need resupply from Earth and they somehow magically have food and lots of water and medical services. It does damage, I think, to the public psyche and appreciation of the difficulty of human spaceflight.
Yeah, no, that's well said, Ken. And I would say, anyone who's spent time in a wilderness environment, and I mean really getting dropped down remotely and having to thrive there, gets a much more pragmatic sense of how difficult survival is. Like, we've gotten so used to civilization here of cities and daily resupply and abundance of everything. In some ways, if you look at the animal literature, any animal that becomes domesticated loses complexity, right? Their brain mass shrinks and their neuronal networks shrink.
Including humans.
Exactly. And so, we're in that sort of domesticated cycle, and it's easy to imagine things that are plausible and capable because intellectually there's not a cost to that.
Right.
But if you have had to thrive, in a place like remote Alaska, or if you've, been in remote expeditions where you've been stuck there and things fall apart, like ad nauseum, you start to realize just the most basic things are so difficult, and it's so easy to die in all of these settings, and I'm a realist and an optimist. So I'm the eternal, let's try and figure out how to do these things. But I'm also, it's really easy to die just on the mountaintop, in the jungle.
Sure.
You pick a spot of just being a little ways outside of civilization, and it's easy to die there or be so debilitated that, you can't carry out the functions that you need to carry out. So yeah, I have a great respect for how difficult this all is. And then I have a great fascination for the pursuit of it. And kind of to a point I think you were getting to earlier, Ken, was that, the moon's a very important place for us. And I know there, in terms of us, meaning this exploration of space paradigm. And I know there's been some talk lately at the government level of, well, let's kind of bypass the moon and go to Mars. And I think I heard in the hearing where Jared spoke, he said, no, that's not going to be the plan. We're going to continue to have a focus on the moon, but very much accelerate our pursuit of Mars. Mm-hmm. And I think that capability that needs to be developed with lunar expeditions, exploration, test beds for all kinds of things is a critical step, because we'll find out there, even as close as that is to the Earth, there's still a lot of danger there, and still a lot of things that have to be solved to even be able to operate there without resupply.
Absolutely. It's non-trivial. And when people say, hey, we've been to the moon, let's just skip it and head straight to Mars, what they're actually telling you is they're not supporting human spaceflight. That concept is normally advanced by someone who is not an advocate of human spaceflight, because we're not going to Mars anytime soon. And one of the things that often catches NASA or snags us is we'll say, okay, we're going to go back to the moon, but everything we do has to be Mars forward. Well, it's going to be hard enough to do the moon. And I think we should try to do the moon and then focus on Mars. But doing dumb things on the moon because you think it's somehow Mars forward is frankly not helpful. And rolling back to your earlier very good comment, I thought, about wilderness and exposure to wilderness. You see, so many people in our culture are overly domesticated and mostly engaged in magical thinking because of how padded our world is. And once you plop them down, as you said, in the middle of Alaska or the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming, even on a relatively safe thing like a NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School experience, they're changed. I mean, you see a remarkable change in the person. And I think it's too bad that more people don't get to have those experiences.
Yeah, it is. We don't talk about this too much publicly, but we do a lot of work with special forces and military and ex-military in just things like hunting and fishing and, support community and togetherness and being in the wilderness. But we'll have things like on an elk hunt once with special forces, and an elk fell on a slope that was basically 60 degrees, and it's out in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. And you're standing on the side of a mountain at a 60-degree slope now, and it's all on you. And it's
very
snowy
dangerous.
And cold and dangerous. And but that's your survival, right? If you're in a remote environment, you have to live off of something that you might hunt. Granted, Mars, lunar won't be like that, of course, but Just
It'd be
thinking in
good to
terms
have
of
some elk
principles.
there. Yeah.
It would. Well, maybe that's a whole new idea with Colossal and all of that, right? Let's
Yeah,
put
just
some
make some
mammoths on the
elk.
moon. We'll start a new program. But that is it. To your point, it gives you a sense that if it's not just handed to you at the store on your plate, this is how it used to be done. This is the kind of complexity, difficulty, risk, and problem solving that has to go into really the most basic things. And so, that domesticated sort of city living, allows some thinking that doesn't have to be tested out in the real world. And I understand that. But then when you're formulating something that does have to be tested in the real world, so much can go wrong. There was that movie of the deep sea diver recently. I'm forgetting the name of the film here.
Yeah,
Last Breath.
Mm-hmm.
What I was amazed by in watching that movie, and I'm kind of awed by, is just watching the technology on the ship, right? And the fact that humans built that, but we couldn't do that, right, centuries ago. And the fact that you can dive to that depth and actually do things. And the fact that what they were fixing down there was helping run civilization itself, right? I was in a kind of a state of awe of how easy civilization has gotten, but also how difficult it is to keep operating. It was like really a kind of a transforming moment to watch that. And it just hit me like, when we do these things in space, everything like that has to be recreated and all the dangers that go with maintaining it, right? And even getting someone to a comfort level like we have is so far down the road in a spacefaring environment.
One other note around that, and this is not biological per se, although it does feed into biology and physiology, is the team dynamic aspect, right? So I think that's heavily underappreciated, that once and you've kind of touched on this already a little bit, but once you put just a small number of people in a very small space together for an extended period of time, I know there's research being done on this, but just so many things can go sideways in that context, right? Especially if you're trying to work in this high risk environment already. And it's not just those individuals working in that environment, but it's also isolated largely from the rest of the world to have any kind of interaction or any kind of mediation in case there are team issues. So I think that's something that's heavily underappreciated and needs to be expanded on more as we're thinking about these future missions. Heavily underappreciated.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Don, and I'm glad you raised it. And there's the behavioral side of that. And in fact, when we think about, so if I were going to go to space, what should I prepare for, right? There's all these steps that we would talk about. But I would say one of the first things you want to figure out is, am I capable of being a good team member? And if I'm not, then how do I get good at it? Because that is going to be really one of my number one elements that'll determine my thriving, maybe my survival, whether I'm having an exceptional or transcendent experience, but even just whether it functions, it'll come down to whether I am that great team member. And, can I both be a follower and can I be a leader? Or when crisis hits, I may be fine when everything's going well, but how will I handle a crisis?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to add one thing to your thought, Don, and that is if you look at remote environments, and these are really the more extreme ones, when you look at the things that degrade team cohesion, ironically, it's things like GI symptoms. So this is where we always look at, when we talk about team cohesion, we look at the behavioral, and we do a lot with team cohesion, but we also look at the biologic, because it turns out in some of these remote studies that GI symptoms degrades team cohesion rapidly. And of course, food degrades and it impacts GI symptoms. There's a range of impacts there. So there's the psychology of team cohesion and kind of capability. And then there's the biology of things that influence capability. And it's one of those reasons, again, why the biomedical side and the behavioral side being so tightly coupled in all of this is going to be so critical. And even the capability to operate the systems in a habitat or in a spacecraft are driven by those features, right? That you raised. So yeah, it's vital to everything we're going to do in space.
Yeah. So Michael, circling back to your book, Building a Spacefaring Nation, your co-editor is Dr. Marianne Legato, and she's an emeritus professor of clinical medicine at Columbia University. She's also a practicing internist in New York City who is known for her gender and sex-specific medicine and research. So first of all, how did you meet Marianne?
Yeah, so she had first reached out to me for our work in precision medicine and spaceflight and personalized medicine. And she was really interested in having a chapter in one of her textbooks. It was called the Textbook of Gender Specific Medicine. I think it was the third edition. And she said, I really want to include something about space in there. And your work on precision medicine would naturally incorporate the differences between men and women, because it also encompasses the difference between, within a sex, right? Between men and between women. So that's how it really started. And so we wrote actually 2 chapters for that book. And that book went on to win the Prose Award from the Association of American Publishers in the category of clinical medicine. So that's where we first connected. And I found her to be one of the really most old school, classical, polished professionals you could ever meet in your life. Just delightful, extraordinary, caring intellectual, and really has a long publishing history of quite a lot of award-winning work with a publisher like Elsevier. So that's really first what drew us together. She had reached out. And then, but I want to say earlier in her career, actually, where it started, she was approached by the American Heart Association. And the question was, and it was through a journalist, whether coronary artery disease was different between men and women. And so they did a lot of work on that, and it ended up in a book that she wrote called The Female Heart, The Truth About Women and Coronary Artery Disease. So that won the Blakesley Award from the American Heart Association, kind of one of her long string of awards for her writing. In that they established that the treatment given to women with heart disease was just far less aggressive than that offered to men, and that it was costing women their lives. And I would just add that, so her conclusion was, well, if these sex-specific differences are affecting the heart, they've got to be affecting everything else. And we're not studying it in the way that is necessary or warranted. And that's really where she decided to, put her career trajectory behind that. And from there, we were asked to do a symposium on spaceflight, and a whole range of things followed. And that led to, our Florence Symposium and our spacefaring textbook, and a range of other works. So, yeah, just a phenomenal human being in every way.
That's fantastic. And just kind of touching on the work that you guys have done together with respect to sex and gender differences, how do the physical challenges that men and women face in space differ?
Yeah, so maybe the way to characterize that is, I'll first say it obviously needs more study, and there are more females in space now. So what I'm going to say is we're trying to better understand how some of the things I'll mention are clearly sex differences, but this is historically what's been found and what's been the case in some of the publications over the years. First of all, orthostatic intolerance. So if you look at the astronauts who come off of a long mission, they often get carried out, and that's because you lose the ability to maintain blood pressure at Earth's gravity for a period of time. That's called orthostatic hypotension, so low blood pressure when you come off of a spacecraft on Earth gravity. And so that recovers after several weeks. But, female astronauts faint more easily after landing than males, and it may have to do with blood vessel flexibility and plasma blood volume loss. The other one is SANS, and that visual intracranial pressure syndrome. It affects male astronauts more heavily than females by about 25%. On in immune function, on Earth, women have stronger immune responses, so that gives them better infection resistance, but higher autoimmune disease risk. I would say that the differences aren't quite clear yet between men and women in immune function in space. We're continuing to get that kind of data in our shorter missions from the Polaris Dawn, 2 men and 2 women, and increasingly there's a kind of a split of 50-50 in some of these missions. So we're gathering that kind of data ourselves, but that's still not entirely resolved. It looks like women appear to be more vulnerable to radiation-induced cancers. So there have been lower permitted exposure levels for female astronauts. I would say on motion sickness, women report a slightly higher rate of space motion sickness. Ironically, men tend to experience a little more symptoms when they return to Earth of motion sickness symptoms. Hearing, we don't really have hearing is one of we have DRGs for those, but hearing is more easily deteriorates in males in general on Earth. Not clear yet in space. A colleague of mine, David Wexler, is doing a project on looking at all of the hearing data from all of the missions, trying to characterize that. So what we would say about the differences right now probably are males are more susceptible to hearing loss, and sensitivity declines with age. on Earth, but we don't exactly know if that changes in space or amplifies in space, and that's what David's group is working on. I would say musculoskeletal doesn't appear to be much difference, but what we haven't done is we haven't flown, let's say in the civilian population, people with osteoporosis or Paget's disease or something like that. So if you have osteoporosis going into space and you're 60 and you're a woman and you have accelerated osteoclastic activity, and we know osteoblasts get impacted negatively in space, is that more problematic for women because they tend to suffer from more osteoporosis on Earth? Still needs to be clarified. Urinary tract infections, more in female astronauts, but urinary retention seems to be an issue across the sexes in space. And then I would say behavioral psychological. I wouldn't say that we know yet that there are dramatic differences in psychological responses or neurobehavioral performance during spaceflight, but that's still being studied. One thing I do want to add here, so I talked earlier about the gene called PEMT, phosphatidyl ethanolamine methyltransferase. And so when the body makes PEMT, it takes a methyl group from methionine and attaches it to phosphatidyl ethanolamine, another phospholipid. And it uses 3-methionine to do that, and now you've got phosphatidylcholine, critical for all membranes across the entire body. If you have the PEMT gene, you have some deficiencies in making phosphatidylcholine, and therefore you need more phosphatidylcholine in the diet. So I tied that back to cognitive function earlier. If you recall, those who were in the highest intake of phosphatidylcholine in the diet from foods like eggs had better cognitive function over time. Here's an interesting, very sex-specific phenomenon. So if you have the PEMT gene, you're very sensitive to having insufficient choline in the diet. In fact, if you have the PEMT mutation, then you're very likely to develop liver function problems. And there's some cognitive implications also, but we'll stick with liver for the moment. If you're on a choline deficient diet. Now, where that really starts to amplify is postmenopausally. So if you have the PEMT gene and you're on a choline deficient diet and you're premenopausal, you might be okay. If you are postmenopausal with a PEMT gene and a choline deficient diet, you may have significant hepatic effects. I mean, these are really like 80% of the women homozygous for this SNP develop liver or muscle dysfunction when they're on low choline diets. That's compared to only about 13% of the women without this SNP. And by SNP, of course, I mean single nucleotide polymorphism. So it's the gene variant for PEMT. Well, that's not a problem that men suffer from. They do have the PEMT gene, but it's not the kinds of dynamics that you have because this is so estrogen driven. So if you are a woman who is postmenopausal with the PEMT gene variant and you're on estrogen, you do not suffer those same problems with the low choline diet. And so, that's a lot of, sort of detailed chemistry. But at the end, what it means is if you're a female with the PEMT gene variant, you need to make sure you have very adequate choline levels in the diet. And, those are like levels like 400 or 500 milligrams a day.
Eat your eggs.
And eggs is probably the best place to get those. Yep. So if you're that woman, PEMT variant homozygous, you need to get a lot of choline in the diet. And if you're premenopausal, okay, you've got some buffering. But if you're postmenopausal, you probably want to be on estrogen just to be safe. Mm-hmm. And this is like the classic picture that we look at for precision medicine. And in this case, one of the key things where we pay more attention to it in women for the reasons just described, because men seem to be able to get away with this a bit easier. But it shows also the convergence between, diet, nutritional supplementation, genotype, sex, and then the operating environment.
Well, Michael, you've certainly had a fascinating career as exemplified in all these discussions, the points that we've had over the course of the interview. And even more exciting is a career in research that is ahead of you. And although your work is just wonderfully interdisciplinary, it's particularly exciting to think about an omics-based approach to identifying and mitigating some of the risks of human spaceflight, and also how these discoveries will benefit life here on Earth. Now, when you were in college, we have a question for you. Is this the kind of career that you envisioned? Or did you have some sort of master plan in place for your career when you were still in college?
So I was blessed by like this deep curiosity. And so that always helped in driving everything that I did. But I'll have to admit, I didn't have this plan. I wanted to go into the space program. I wanted to go into human performance, being an athlete and living, in a pretty extreme area, living outdoors. I loved that intersection between, performance and medicine and biology. And, back in those days, things like sports medicine and space medicine weren't as developed as they are now. So I didn't have a master plan in place other than to know I was deeply curious. I wanted to get very well trained, the love of the molecular, and I knew that it played into virtually everything we did. But I did have to find a path. And, I'll admit there was a time in my late 30s, maybe my mid 30s, where I started wondering, okay, how do you align all of these sort of not disparate, but they're certainly diverse interests? And I'll just quickly say I did this Johnson O'Connor Research Institute aptitude testing. It wasn't just interest, right? It was actual aptitudes. And, they said at the end, you have all these aptitudes, but, in order to be content with what you're doing, you have to try to solve a problem that's unsolvable in your lifetime. And, that's not everybody's path, but that's the counsel I was given. And when they said that, I went, okay, that I get. Now I get it. It's this process of discovery and doing interesting things and applying what I've learned and what I love and what I continue to learn. So I realized I had to build something around a central core and a common thread. And that's where I really built the central premise of my own work on complex molecular analytics. And so I thought, that can hang everything together from space to military to athletes and even clinical medicine, right? Because everything we do, we try to help translate into clinical medicine. So it kind of broke down into two, let's say, premises, and that was describing human molecular responses to any challenging environment as thoroughly as possible. And then we integrate the physiology, morphology, behavior, and then focus on rapidly developing solutions to the extent possible, because we know careers are short, needs are high. When someone's sitting in front of you who's a Navy SEAL who's 35 and busted up, he can't wait for the literature to solve something in 20 years. So that was really informative for me too, having been an athlete. Like there's a doc sitting in front of somebody every day by the millions, and that person needs an answer. So how do we accelerate that path to the answer? Because we're never going to know everything. So part of it then is how do we triage acting with so often, usually insufficient information, and still do the right thing and the best thing. So that's, I think that's probably a good synopsis. We, focused on knowledge development, coupling it with countermeasure development.
It is a good synopsis, and I can see how it worked for you, given your interests. So following up on that, STEM Talk has a large graduate student and some undergraduates and lots of postdocs as listeners. And so the final question will be, do you have any advice for students and young researchers as well who are sort of early in their career? People always give sort of inane advice, follow your passion, that kind of thing. Well, of course. But do you have any actionable sort of good advice?
Yeah, I think, you do have to do what's meaningful, right? You do want to find out, am I on someone else's pursuit?
For sure.
Or what is really meaningful to me enough that I'll get up and do it every day, regardless of whether I get paid. That to me is, one of the testing questions. What do I want to get up and do every day in the morning? I have students who talk about wanting to be a clinician or wanting to be in a lab. And I said, well, you should think about, are you going to want to go into a patient's room every day? Because that environment won't change. It's just one room to the next. But if that's something you want to do, that's what you should think about. But others have said, well, I just can't see myself sitting in the benchtop in a lab every day. I need to be out in the field somewhere outside. And so, so for me, understanding that part of it, well, what does this discipline I'm pursuing consist of every day? And really looking at people who do it, following them, understanding, could I do this part of the practice of the art every day in that environment where it exists? And if it doesn't, can I find one that meets that need? I think a really critical thing in my view is to develop a primary skill set and get very, very good at it, to understand. So part of what's meaningful and what do you love then is bolstered by, okay, well, what's the skill set that I have to have? And I've got to get good at it. I've always told our athletes and our academics, find the hardest working person that you can see and outwork that person. It does have to come down to, I think, the amount of effort that you put to become that expert, that really disciplined scholar or practitioner or whatever that is. So I think you have to think about it in terms of, really outworking the other person. And I don't mean to make life a competition, but, what that generates for you is a capability that's going to really serve you well in any field when people see that.
I often tell young people, be good at something. And, it's one thing to love something, but you need to be good at it.
Yep. Be really valuable, right? Be good at it, become really valuable in that one skill set, and then start to morph around that by studying the things that reinforce that, or that might even be a weakness of yours. So I would also say, we give a lot of attention to studying what we're good at, but we don't work on our weaknesses. And that's where I would say some of the people, let's say in the medicine, in the sciences, maybe don't spend as much time on the human element, right? Very good analytical people aren't necessarily good empathic people. And there's what's called the analytical network in the brain and the empathic network. And people who are strong in the analytical network tend to reinforce that. People who are strong in the empathic network, we're always using both. But people who are strong in the empathic network don't always reinforce the analytical or grow it. So I'd say really work on, and this goes back to Don, your comment about team cohesion, really work on becoming just the best possible team member. And, treat everyone with kindness and empathy, but realize that nothing gets done in these fields on your own. So being agreeable, likable, and then being a great listener. It's easy for people who are extremely brilliant. Like in some of our classes in MIT, and this was during, when I was already a professional, there was a brilliant kid in the back of the room that was just kind of ahead of everybody else. And he was just firing away at the professor and irritating the heck out of the rest of the class. And the professors were getting frustrated. But I could see that kid was brilliant and he wanted to go further than what was happening. And this was on big data and machine learning, analytics, and all that kind of stuff. But my advice to him would have been, okay, find another way to get what you need there. Find a way to be that agreeable guy, that conscientious guy, that team member. Figure out how to lead and follow. So I would end that with become an expert listener.
Yeah.
Really listen wherever you go. And if you ever get a chance to sit with somebody who's your 20, 30 years senior, not everything is in their papers. They can tell you in 30 minutes some things you've never heard before. And I would find those people and I would listen to those people. And that's something I did. I purposely sought out, my elders. And if they were the expert or the lead in something and I was 30 years younger, I found them and tried to see if they'd talk to me.
I did the exact same thing.
Same here.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah.
By the way, John Clark, who we talked about, was one of them. And Ken Ford is another, and I go down the list. I say that my mentors were, so much of why I get to do what I get to do now. And I think all of us, on this interview can say that.
Yeah.
That was a great chunk of advice you gave. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been just a fantastic discussion with you, Michael.
It's really fun.
Yeah, you guys have been a delight. I really appreciate the work you're doing. I'm so grateful that we've had a chance to have these discussions here, and I look forward to anything we might get to do together in the future.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So I have to say, it's really exciting thinking about a future mission to the moon and potentially Mars. And I really appreciate how Michael is among those leading the way and helping us understand the impact that space travel will have on humans. It's very important work, especially now that civilians are getting opportunities to travel into space.
Don, I absolutely agree. And I also hope that after listening to Michael today and other STEM Talk guests like Pascal Lee's recent episode, our listeners will have a better idea of the challenges and opportunities before humanity as we move toward becoming a spacefaring civilization.
It's an exciting time. This is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.